Hey everybody, it is Wednesday, April 15th. Welcome to my garage. I appreciate the comments that some of y'all left on the last video, Monday's video about the Dred Scott decision and some review of the 6th and 8th Amendments, but particularly Dred Scott. What an impactful, horrible, but important decision that was from the U.S. Supreme Court back in 1857. Today, we're going to skip ahead a bit to 1896 and talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, another very important case in American history, a case that relates to the rights of all Americans, but specifically people of color, people of African descent. But before that, I need to give you a factual and accurate, but oversimplification and a quick little summary of what happened in between 1857 and 1896. Now, you don't have to memorize those dates. Remember, I don't do dates and memorization in this class. I know that's not how most people learn. But 1857, as I mentioned, was the year that the Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott decision, and it was right before the Civil War. I mean, it was about 2.5 years before the election of Abraham Lincoln, and when Lincoln was elected, states began seceding. Now, they blamed Lincoln for why they were leaving the Union, these southern states, but this had been brewing for a long time. As I said on Monday, the Supreme Court, at least some of them, really thought that they were going to put an end to some of this slavery controversy in the United States, when in fact they did the opposite. They upset a lot of people, both black and white, and the United States and overseas. I mean, people were thinking, caring, compassionate people the world over were outraged by the Dred Scott decision. And the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln, who was not a radical, but he was anti-slavery, is elected to the White House. South Carolina secedes from the Union. A few other states, about 10 other states follow. And what ensues is a civil war. The Union fights to keep those states as part of the Union. Abraham Lincoln's official position is that they never succeeded, that you can't leave the Union. The southern states said, no, we have that right. We have the right to leave. We don't like what's going on. Abraham Lincoln said, oh, no, you don't. And after 4 very long, bloody years, 700,000 or so dead Americans, many of them black. Don't ever forget that. We don't have time to get too far into that in this class, but never forget there were many, many, many black troops who fought in the Civil War. I believe Dave Chappelle said that black people damn near freed themselves. And there's quite a bit of accuracy to that statement. Yeah, there were these white politicians in Washington, sure, but by the end of the war, I believe the ratio was 1 in 8 Union soldiers, I believe, were black men, black people. So, long, bloody war. The North wins the war, clearly. About halfway through the war, Abraham Lincoln realizes that not everybody's on the same page, that everyone in the North is fighting for different reasons, and people need a real motivation. So to remind them of things like Dred Scott, to remind the Northern troops and the Northern people of the atrocities of slavery, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which really arguable as to how many slaves were actually freed by that executive order. But not too long after, Lincoln and Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which we talked about last week in this class, which formally outlawed slavery. So, the war is over, sort of. There's no more so-called Confederacy. There's no more so-called Confederate army of troops and fighting Northern troops. However, the controversy is not over. Slaves are legally freed. Okay, but now what? Now what? What happens next? What happens not only to all these former slaves living in the South, but also, what about all these white people who fought on the side of the Confederacy? What about the Southern economy? The economy was based largely on cotton, which relied on people living in bondage, on slave labor. Not just cotton, but other agricultural products. That was the heart of the Southern economy. And without the slaves, it became much more expensive to produce those agricultural products. So we enter a period of U.S. history called Reconstruction. Reconstruction was ostensibly about reconstruction of the Union, but it was one of the most intricate and complicated political times in our nation's history. If Abraham Lincoln had lived things would have been a little bit different, but it still would not have been an easy process to bring these states back into the Union officially and to figure out how to make sure that the former slaves were treated like citizens, like people. Because just because the North won the war doesn't mean that the Dred Scott decision is not still the law of the land. I mean, a lot of that's impacted by the 13th Amendment for sure, and the 15th Amendment. But the question is, what about the 14th Amendment? What about that clause of that amendment, equal protection clause that says, to paraphrase, that everyone must be treated the same under the law? Well, for a few years after the Civil War, there was some marked progress. I'm not saying things were perfect. I'm not saying things were great for the former slaves. I am saying there was some access to the polls for black men who were now eligible to vote, regardless of whether they had been free before the war. They were free now. And remember, Dred Scott decision, Justice Taney said that black people of African descent, did not have the rights of citizenship, regardless of whether they were free or slave. 14th Amendment says, first of all, yeah, anybody born on U.S. soil is a citizen. And it also says that the law must treat people equally. And it says that states and local governments cannot treat people unequally under the law. Okay. I mean, that sounds good. Like I said last week, just because it's in the Constitution, that means it's the ultimate law, but it doesn't mean that people have to interpret it the way that I would interpret it or that you would interpret it. And what happens slowly over the decades after the war in the southern states is a process of systematic racial discrimination, of the southern state governments going, okay, so they're not slaves anymore, but they're not like us, the ruling class. One thing throughout history, not just U.S. history, world history, is that when a small number of people have all the political power, they will do anything, usually consciously, sometimes subconsciously, sometimes without even knowing it, but usually consciously. They will do anything to hold on to that power. And what does that mean? In the minds of oppressive, powerful people, that means making sure that no one else usurps some of that power. Another thing I want you to remember from this class is that rights and privileges of people in this country are not a pie. Meaning, if I take a slice, that doesn't mean that there's some missing for you. And if you take some, it doesn't mean that I've lost some. When people of color and any minorities, women, LGBT community, when any minority groups gain rights they haven't previously had under the law, it doesn't take away my rights because I'm a white man. It doesn't mean, in other words, when black people have the right to vote, that doesn't mean I don't have the right to vote. Does it mean my voice matters less? Maybe, but this is supposed to be a democracy. All the people who have the right to vote under the law, I want them to vote. Not everybody feels that way, but if this is going to be a representative government, then white people like me ought to feel that way. We ought to know that when a person of color gets the right to vote, it doesn't mean that I've lost that right. When 1967, when people of color, people of African descent gained the right under the law to marry white people, it doesn't mean that I have lost the right to marry white people. You see what I'm saying? Rights are not a pie. You take your slice, doesn't mean that, oh, there's less slices for me. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. It's not a finite amount of rights. There's only so much to go around. However, people in power try to keep that power. And what do they do down south? Well, the folks who were responsible for the Civil War, people who were former slave owners themselves and the sons and grandsons of former slave owners, they knew it probably would not be good for them politically if black people had equal rights. So they start passing these laws that came to be known as the Black Codes. Code meaning a code like a statute, like part of a state statutory language. And some states I've heard, and I will say I've never researched this myself, but I remember hearing this multiple times when I was in college, that there were states that took what used to be called slave codes, the laws that govern slavery, like, slaves weren't allowed to read and they weren't allowed to have certain property rights and that kind of thing, even former slaves. Some states even crossed the word, just deleted the word slave and inserted the word black, and they passed state laws that if you read them, made it sound like black people after 1865 were still slaves. Legally, they weren't under federal law, but maybe you're not technically the property of another person, but if you can't legally go to school and you can't legally own a business or sell your goods and services in the open market, okay, so I guess that's better than being a slave, but it's not good. It's not good at all. And those are the decades that follow the Civil War when it comes to the rights of people of African descent in the American South. So, one thing that starts popping up in every single southern state, and some northern states as well, in those years, and when I say those years, I mean between the 1860s and the 1890s and in the early 1900s. What happened in those years was segregation. So it's no longer illegal for a black person to walk down the street because he's a free man. He doesn't need his owner's permission because he doesn't legally have an owner. He is a free man. Okay, so what are these southern states and cities and counties going to do to make sure that people of color don't have the exact same rights as the white people there? They passed laws having to do with public services, segregation, separate amenities, separate bathrooms, separate types of businesses, separate places to sit, and separate cars and public transportation in the trains. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, first of all, it's really important to remember our past, so we don't find ourselves falling into patterns of oppressive and ignorant behavior in this country. But also because there was a man named Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy was a man in Louisiana who was 1/8 African descent. He was 1/8 black. But under Louisiana law, he was considered black for purposes of segregated services. So, there were public transportation systems in Louisiana, and Homer Plessy is recruited by a group of civil rights activists who were trying to get the courts to rule on things like the 14th Amendment, due process, equal protection, citizenship clause, as relates to these Southern segregationist laws. New Orleans, then as now, has streetcars. But unlike now, people didn't have automobiles, so it's how a lot of folks got around was in the streetcars. Homer Plessy intentionally, I mean, he didn't do this by accident. He intentionally rides on the white streetcar. And again, this man is not someone that every white person on the car would automatically identify as a black man. He's 1/8 black. He's arrested, and he's found guilty of violating a local law in New Orleans that said that amenities like streetcars, other public services, could be separate as long as the quality was equal. Now I'm paraphrasing a bit. I think the law actually said equal but separate. So they can be separate as long as they're the same quality, therefore not violating the 14th Amendment, according to Louisiana, according to local folks in New Orleans. And so he challenges his conviction in state court, and his conviction is upheld. And so he goes to federal court and ends up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think y'all know where this is going, because those of you that know some history of the Civil Rights Movement, or just American history in general, you know that the Supreme Court did not strike down the racist practice of so-called separate but equal amenities and facilities and services until Brown versus Board of Education in the mid-20th century, the mid-1900s. Brown versus Board of Education is very important, and we're going to talk about it next week as part of a little discussion of the Civil Rights Movement. But Plessy is important because this is already happening all over the South. By the 1890s, this was very commonplace to have these separate public services for people of color. And this was the Supreme Court saying, 1896, that Separate amenities were fine. They did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. They said that under the so-called police power in the Constitution, state legislatures had the ability to say, yeah, we're going to have segregated services. This is obviously problematic because if you remember studying the separate but equal doctrine in high school or maybe other college classes, there was nothing equal about these services. It was just a phrase that some states and local governments used to justify having inferior quality services for black people. Black people were still paying taxes. They were still paying whatever it cost to ride the streetcar, but they had to ride in a separate car. Later on, of course, in the 20th century, this is probably Plessy versus Ferguson is a big case for legal nerds and for political science scholars and just people like me who like to read this stuff and discuss it. But it's probably I'd say the second best example in U.S. history of a person of African descent saying, I'm not riding in the black part of this public transit. And the most notorious and ultimately wonderful example of that would be Rosa Parks. But that's a few decades later, and we'll get to that next week. For today, I just want you all to know that there was a case about a man named Homer Plessy who intentionally challenged the institutional racism of the state of Louisiana, although in the city of New Orleans, although honestly it could have been any state and city, as we'll learn, we'll talk about it next week. Brown versus Board of Education was actually in Kansas. That was not in some deep South state like Louisiana or Mississippi. That was in Kansas. So these policies were widespread in the years following the Civil War. It's very, you can make a very strong case that there are still a lot of separate but equal amenities, particularly in our public school system in the United States today. So take a look at this. There's the topics covered in your textbook if you want. Also, like I said on Monday, last lecture, if you want to Google this and read the opinion of Plessy versus Ferguson, read it. Supreme Court opinions they can be dry at times with a lot of legalese and lawyer jargon, but in the case of cases like Dred Scott and Plessy, these are cases that are important for us to read and understand every word and phrase that the majority opinion uses. I will say one thing before we sign off here about the Plessy decision. The one dissent, what do I mean by dissent? I mean a justice on the Supreme Court who did not agree with the majority. It was, I believe it was a 7-1 opinion, and 7-1. And the lone dissenter was Kentucky's own John Marshall Harlan. He was a Kentuckian, a very important figure in the history of the United States, of the Supreme Court, and of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. But he was an interesting person, and he certainly said the right thing about this case and did the right thing by voting against the majority and saying that Louisiana's laws about segregation and segregated services were racist and were wrong and violated the 14th Amendment. However, he was born in, I believe, Boone County. I know he was born in Kentucky, and his father was a slave owner. But John Marshall Harlan had a half-brother who was half-black. And historians believe that his brother played a pretty large role in the way that Justice Harlan eventually interpreted the 14th Amendment and other civil rights from the bench of the Supreme Court. So if you want something else to do, this is not an assignment, but if you want to learn a little bit more about the topics covered in this class, read up a bit on, get online and read up a bit on Justice John Marshall Harlan, 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 from Kentucky. Again, not a perfect individual, but an interesting one who eventually came around to seeing things the right way on a number of issues before the Supreme Court. All right, with that, y'all make sure, comment below that you watched the video. If you have any questions or thoughts, put those in the comments as well. I hope everybody's staying socially distanced. I hope that everyone's staying safe. I hope you and your families have your jobs or some way to provide for each other, and I hope everyone's doing well. Otherwise, I will see y'all on Monday. Thanks so much for watching.